Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be discussing the interconnections between families and the early childhood education and care sector. Today we're going to take a brief look at the intersections between family life and the sector as families are faced with choosing the early years service for their family. As we discuss this intersection, you will recall Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory and the interconnectedness between the micro and meso and exosystems as relationships are built and play out. Firstly, I would like to open our discussion today by talking about the notion of the duality of the early childhood education and care sector. And the duality includes two main foci: workforce participation and early childhood education. The ECEC sector has met two primary objectives since about the 1980s. Firstly, successive federal governments have leveraged the ECEC sector to support workforce participation rates of parents. Childcare subsidies, aimed at paying a portion of the family's childcare fees, have been in place for families since the late 1980s. Successive funding policies have used criteria relevant to working, studying, or looking for work as the prerequisites of funding support to access childcare. The second focus of the early years education and care sector is that of the importance of early childhood education. Contemporary childcare in Australia has championed the evidence for the impact of the quality of educational programs for young children now for decades. This advocacy campaign has leveraged the growing international evidence base of the importance of early experiences and early childhood education for young children to improve child outcomes in the here and the now, but also into children's future development and schooling outcomes. Research has also been generated from leading economists such as James Heckman, based on economic rationalisation and the return of financial investments in the early years on later economic growth and performance. This has been another major aspect of the advocacy campaign and the rationale for more government investment into the early years. Looking at the economic rationalisation agenda, a range of studies by Heckman and other economists make the argument that for every dollar spent investing in the provision of ECEC, there's a later return of investment from anywhere from $10 to $13 for governments. As you might imagine, this empirical evidence based in economic forecast models and longitudinal research has been of great interest to governments around the world and has certainly added depth of argument to the educational advocacy work around the world. As a result, there has been an ever-increasing focus on the march towards the professionalisation of the ECEC workforce and the focus on the quality of educational programs delivered in the ECEC sector. This evidence has helped inform a growing suite of public policy impacting the Australian ECE sector. Things like the Early Childhood Reform Agenda, including the National Quality Framework, the National Quality Standards, and the EYLF have been developed as a direct result of this advocacy campaign and evidence base to support the work. Given the imperatives for children to access formal ECEC programs backed up by research and advocacy, it brings into sharp focus the choices and decisions parents make in selecting the right ECEC service and program for their child. The 2018 childcare census indicates that the majority of children in Australia access some form of formal care arrangements on a regular basis before they enter primary school. For example, by age 4, over 90% of children are attending a kindergarten or a preschool for at least some part of the week. What do parents then look for, and what does the sector offer, and how do parents find the perfect match? It goes without saying that educators and teachers can only build relationships with families when they actually have families accessing their service. So as we consider the relationships that are necessary between educators and families to support optimal outcomes for children, it is worth understanding how the Australian sector operates and the choices that families have at their fingertips in selecting the very right early learning service for their families. So the sector provides three major service models for families to choose from for children before school age, and they include family daycare, long day care, and sessional kindergarten and preschools. Family daycare is provided by educators to very small groups of children, 4 under the age of school age, in the educator's own home. And the hours of operations in family daycare are incredibly flexible. So the benefits here are the very small group sizes for some children and the homely environment that is provided by the carers and the extremely flexible working hours, which can include weekends and evenings. Long day care, by comparison, operates for long hours as the name would suggest, so anywhere up to 12 hours a day, and they're usually provided between 48 to 52 weeks a year. So they're larger facilities with a range of rooms and services to cater for age groups that are all together. LDCs employ teachers as well as educators, and the benefits of being in the LDC is that they generally have a more qualified workforce than family daycare. They're in a highly supervised environment with management on site, and of course there's greater opportunities for children to mix in much larger groups working in an LDC environment. Community kindergartens and preschools are the traditional models of early learning and education care provision in this country, and they traditionally provide sessional care, so just between school hours, 9 and 3, and they only work through school terms. The program is delivered by qualified teachers and usually works in conjunction with schools in very close relationships. Many of them are community owned and delivered, which means that they're non-for-profit and that they're organised and run by parent committee. Many kindergarten and preschools are now providing before and after session care to compete with the more flexible and long-term arrangements that can be found in long day care. This model has had a really long history in Australia, and many parents feel extremely comfortable in trusting their community-based kindergarten or preschool. Regardless of the type of service families access, there are obviously a range of reasons that parents make the decision to send their children to an early years service. There is also no doubt that for young families it is an important decision, financially and emotionally. Many families speak of the confusion about where to begin and what to look for in making the selection of where to send their children, and for many, the notion of play-based learning remains a confusing concept for parents. Riverland and Fleer support this anecdotal parental view, stating that the early childhood community has developed its own discourses, rhetoric, practices, and theoretical perspectives to facilitate communication and understanding between colleagues, but from the outsider's perspective, it's often hard to understand and confusing and is almost a world unto itself. This initial potential disconnection between families and the ECE professional is concerning and must be really acknowledged by the professional, especially in those initial interactions with new families, to be able to better support the establishment of a positive relationship based on shared values and beliefs. Parents who are confused are apt to make poor decisions about where to send their children, and there is an increased likelihood of risk of dissatisfaction with the service that they enrol in. Parental dissatisfaction with the quality of relationships and the way in which they transition and orientate into a new service can be a really significant impact on their decision to stay or the decision to actually seek an alternative arrangement for their children. So now let's take a brief look at the intersection between family needs and the actual service provision that's on offer. Meeting the needs of families also means meeting the needs for genuine human connection with their child and their family unit. To make these authentic connections with families, teachers and educators must go beyond understanding the pragmatics of sleep habits and food allergies and attendance patterns. Often, ECE services rely on gathering profile type information for enrolment forms, etc. But there's far more important information that teachers and educators should be gathering to give a deeper insight into the functioning of the family unit and the past experiences that the children and families bring to the centre and to their programs. A genuine understanding of families' hopes, dreams and desires for their children is an essential outreach to parents to form the building blocks of meaningful relationships with families. If we begin to consider the types of information that families have to actually weigh up in making the decision about where to enrol their child, we can start to gain a glimmer of understanding of why it can be so confusing and overwhelming for parents, particularly new to making these sorts of decisions. Families need to decide when they want to enrol their child to begin, how young or how old their child will be when they begin, how often they will attend, and of course where they are going to choose to enrol. For families, particularly first-time families that are new to this process, each of these can seem a challenge. Confusing information existing about attendance patterns. How much is too much? How much is not enough to gain the benefits of attending an early learning program? And then we think about how families understand the quality ratings of the services that they're reviewing for enrolment. Do they really understand the difference between a working towards rated centre and an exceeding one? And most importantly, when they actually begin to make physical visits to services, to do centre tours and meet the staff and team, what should they be actually looking for in terms of facilities, in terms of program provision, and in terms of what is the right sort of educator to meet the needs of their young child? All of these things add to the complexity and the feeling of being overwhelmed by the information that families have to negotiate in reaching a decision to enrol. And while this choice for families is extensive, the media often complicate it further by showing families in desperate circumstances, placing their children on long waiting lists in order to gain access to centres and ready to take on anything that may be offered. The reality is usually not quite so desperate. In the vast majority of cases, families work with their early years providers to successfully meet their families' needs for access. Finding the service that is a good fit for their family's emotional and social needs can prove more challenging than all of the above. In exploring the choices and decisions that families undertake in choosing a service to enrol their young child in, the cost of service provision is certainly one of those considerations. The cost of childcare is an absolutely well recognised barrier for access to early learning programs. And for a large number of Australian families, the cost of childcare forms a significant aspect of their weekly budget. Subsidies for childcare are based on families meeting activity tests for work, study or looking for work criteria and associated travel, and is means tested against combined family incomes. The recent report on the impact of the new childcare subsidy released by the government has identified that the Australian government is forecast to spend some $8 billion annually under the new childcare subsidy legislation to support the cost of childcare for families. And an estimated 1 million families annually, representing some 1.3 million children, access early learning programs in this country and are subsidised as a result of legislation under the CCS. It's a significant investment to help families afford to send their children to early learning for all the benefits that we know come with high quality care and education. Australia has made increasing financial investments in the early years over a number of years. However, we're still a long way behind the support offered in other countries around the world, such as the UK, who last year introduced free childcare and early learning programs for all 3-year-olds and all 4-year-olds. And of course, some of the Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden are known for their care and financial support of access to early learning. So as we consider the million-odd families who will be accessing early learning programs across the sector, it's worthwhile to consider what exactly is the scale and size of the early childhood education care sector in Australia and its capacity to meet the demands of Australian families. A range of publications, including the Childcare Census and the Australian Childcare Alliance reports, and annual reports from large providers indicate that the average occupancy rates across the sector are somewhere in the mid to high 80% range. But in general, the supply and demand of childcare places is keeping pace with the needs of our communities. Of course, the government and developers must keep future population growth in mind to ensure that the demand does not outstrip the supply. Using big data that we've spoken about before in earlier lectures is a really important governmental tool and development tool at population level to provide information to assist both governments and developers alike to keep both supply and demand and community infrastructure balanced. Data from ASIQA and the Australian Childcare Alliance indicate that there are some 15,500 childcare centres operating in Australia, and nearly half of those are long daycare services, with community preschools and kindergartens holding about 20% of that number and family daycare making up about 7%. And the remainder of regulated services have a focus around supporting families with children who are school age in our outside school hours care services. As part of the statistical information held in big data, there is also evidence in some urban areas of an oversupply of childcare places, where we see services that are well below 50% occupied in pockets around the country. While initially this may look to be good for family choice and flexibility, long-term financial sustainability of these centres is a concern. Centres closing down for reasons of viability is a stressful and terrible situation for children and families from a relationship disruption perspective, and of course for the educative teams involved from an employment and sustainability perspective. So getting the balance right between supply and demand is a really complex piece of work that is very critical to the overall sustainability of the sector as a whole. The use of partnership as well as relationships is an important aspect to consider. The notion of a partnership gives rise to the notion of parental participation in their children's education with their child's teacher and educators. Partnerships are identified in documents such as the EYLF and the NQS and the Family Schools Partnership Framework in primary schools as an essential piece of how professionals are to engage in their work. Establishing true partnerships relies on educators, teachers, schools and service providers to genuinely look at the enablers and barriers to participation by families. Many schools and service providers are finding innovative ways to connect in authentic ways with families and incorporate their participation into their child's learning journey. The use of technology in particular has been a boon for engagement and two-way communication that was not available for former generations. And there have been an explosion of software suited to support parent and teacher engagement and the sharing of ideas and resources to support the educational goals of children. The process and experience of transition is one where partnerships are really important and come into sharp focus. Transition has been a growing focus of research in Australia and elsewhere. Government, schools and the ECEC sector are exploring innovative strategies to improve the alignment and continuity between the sectors. Policy documents, including the EYLF and My Time, Our Place for school-age care, sets down very clear expectations for the transitional processes to optimise the continuity between ECEC, outside school hours care and school contexts. Effective partnerships with families assist in the communication and information sharing between the family and the ECC and the schooling context. There is still much work to be done in this space to ensure better transitions for children and families as they negotiate the borderlands between the sectors and to improve the experience of doing with rather than doing to that many families still experience. In this topic, we have explored some critical components of relationships, challenging context for families, and the interconnection between families and the educational sector. In our next lecturette, we will begin to explore some of the enabling conditions that support well-being of children and families. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next session together.